Hello guys, welcome back to our anime moments. Guys, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Today is explanation of upcoming episode of Tales of Herding Gods based on novel. So let's start. Could it be that this place will be invaded by the darkness? Why else must we leave before the sky turns dark? Mu Qingdai asked. Qin Mu shook his head, but didn't explain in detail. Everyone was waiting outside the divine hall when the sky suddenly turned dim and thunder could be faintly heard. Qin Mu raised his head to look at the sky that was still clear a moment ago. By then, it was covered with densely packed dark clouds. It was winter season and the weather was cold, so there would rarely be thunder and much less lightning. Yet there were dark clouds and thunder above their heads. The dark clouds became thicker and thicker, slowly covering the entire sky. A heavy shower then started, and everyone hurried to hide under the roof of the divine hall to avoid the icy cold rainwater. The rain shouldn't have been this heavy in the winter season, yet it was pouring heavily over them. The dozen flood dragon also squeezed in under the roof and coiled around the bronze pillars to avoid the heavy rain. The dragon Qin was taking a nap at the entrance, since he could avoid the rain there. The buck went to the dragon Qilin's side and lowered its head. With its horns, it flung the dragon Qilin out of the hall and took his spot. The dragon Qilin was furious when he got drenched by the rain. He walked back with his mouth opened wide, and the buck jumped up and shook its huge horns, readying itself to fight any time. Steaming water vapor suddenly rose from the ground, and Long Yu stretched his hands out and caught a handful of rainwater. "The water is hot," he said in astonishment. Qin Mu's heart stirred slightly, and he stretched his hands out as well. The rain coming down from the sky was indeed hot. It was as scalding as boiling water. He immediately walked out of the divine hall, and his vital burst forth to split the rainwater to the side so it didn't land on his body. He raised his head to take a look and saw that the sky had become very dark. In the pitch black above, there was lightning moving through the dark clouds from time to time, and the rumblings of thunder could be heard from 1,000 miles away. It was rolling above them at an extremely fast speed before leaving into the distance. In a split second, the thunder had rolled 2,000 miles forward. It didn't sound like a thunderclap that could be produced by lightning. Wang Muren and the rest also walked out from the divine hall and raised their heads to look. They saw more and more lightning, and when the bolts crossed each other while slicing through the pitch-black clouds, it was very terrifying. The rain falling from the sky became hotter and hotter. There seems to be something happening in the sky. "Fatty dragon, put that buck down." Qin Mu turned back and shouted out. The dragon Qilin loosed the grip of his jaws and let go off of the buck's neck. The buck was furious and wanted to attack, but it got squashed by the dragon Qilin sitting on top of it, which felt like an immovable mountain rather than a living creature. The thunder in the sky became more and more frequent as though there was a giant beating onto a war drum. The lightning in the meantime transformed into balls that rolled around, lighting up the darkness. Layers of heavens opened up in Qin Mu's eyes as he looked at the clouds. Suddenly, he could faintly see figures flashing in the sky. Those figures leaped around through the clouds and fought each other. Wang Muren, Long Yu, and Mu Qingdao from Little Jade Capital had also learned spells like the Third Eye or Divine Eye. They all executed their spells to look up and couldn't help crying out in astonishment. Suddenly, the thick and heavy dark clouds were torn apart as a tall and imposing figure appeared in the darkness. He wielded two huge knives, and the lightning flashing next to him made him look even more fierce than usual, both excited and sinister. "Grandpa Butcher!" Qin Mu cried out in astonishment. He had seen Butcher's crazy side before, since Butcher frequently went crazy in disabled elderly village. He could even slash village chief when in that mood. He would only reveal a slight tenderness when facing Qin Mu. As his cry of astonishment rang out, a few more figures appeared in the tear in the dark clouds, going straight for Butcher. The dark cloud had been torn by Grandpa Butcher's knives. While Qin Mu realized that, the dark cloud closed and thunder rumbled again. But the constant booming actually didn't come from thunder, it was the loud bangs created from the rapidly moving bodies. Butcher's knives split open the sky, and since they were incomparably hot, they raised the temperature of the clouds to boiling. Thus, the rain coming down became more and more scorching. At that moment, Qin Mu saw a majestic piece of land descend from the sky while passing through the clouds. It had mountains and rivers, and was just opposite to the land they were on. It looked like it was going to collide with Eternal Peace Empire, and the sight was astonishing. "Abba," Mute said solemnly. "That's right, it's Village Chief." Qin Mu nodded repeatedly. "Village Chief is also above, so who are they fighting?" The land in the sky seemed to have met its nemesis as it flew back into the clouds. The mountains and rivers suddenly crumbled to pieces. Qin Mu was stunned. Village Chief's sword skill was broken. Rumble. The sky trembled violently. A pillar that was dozens of yards thick descended from the sky and pierced through the clouds. It seemed like something from heaven coming straight for earth. However, it wasn't a pillar. Instead, it was a frantically swirling current that was like a spear formed by huge water dragons coiling around one another. Someone was gathering water as a spear. Grandpa Blind spear skill. Qin Mu's mind was blown. The incomparably thick water dragon spear was nothing else but Blind spear. Blind rarely used a weapon. Even when faced with existences of the cult master level, he usually used a bamboo cane to finish the battle. A bamboo cane was enough for him to break all spells and divine arts in the world. Yet at that moment he had gathered water into a spear, so he should have met a strong enemy which caused him some trouble. With a solemn expression, Mute turned around to walk back into the divine hall. He carried his wooden chest out and pointed at Qin Mu. Qin Mu nodded solemnly and said, "Grandpa Mute, don't worry, I will definitely not run around. However, I can also help, I have many powerful flood dragons under me." Mute raised his eyebrows and revealed an expression that looked like he was smiling yet not smiling. Qin Mu blushed and said in a low voice, "They are still powerful though." Mute jumped up, but then he paused 10 yards in the sky and floated motionlessly. Among the heavy rain, blood flood dragons crawled over from all directions and encircled the immortal sacred ground layer after layer. Thump! Mute's feet landed on the ground, and 2 deep footsteps were left behind. The surroundings of the footprints crackled, and the stone slabs exploded, while the farther ones cracked. Mute placed the chest down on the ground, and its lid automatically opened, revealing a chest filled with silver pellets that were the size of a thumb. On Mute's back was a huge furnace which he often used. Yet even after placing the chest, the huge cylinder furnace was not removed. He was still carrying it. The furnace had long been extinguished and was jet black. Mute clasped his hands tightly, and his vital chi burst forth. The furnace behind his back suddenly blazed fiercely with flames. The blood flood dragons stopped in their footsteps. Some of them had been climbing up the railings while others were squatting on stone lions' heads. Some stopped at the stone stairs while others were on the roofs of the halls behind Qin Mu and the rest. The surroundings were under the cover of darkness, but incomparably heavy footsteps could be heard from it. There was also a heavy breathing that was steady yet frantic. The chest before Mute's feet rattled and trembled continuously. The Emperor's disc suddenly flew out and landed in Qin Mu's hand. Mute didn't even turn his head back. He just raised his hand, and his 5 fingers moved as he did a few hand signals. Qin Mu hung the Emperor's disc on his chest and said solemnly, "Grandpa Mute asked us to retreat into the divine hall. Fatty dragon, quickly get up, don't sit on that buck until it dies." The dragon Qilin immediately stood up from the buck who was sprawled out on all 4. It gasped for breath, its tongue stretched long before it. "Pa?" The dragon Qilin spat a mouth of dragon saliva at the buck. "This glutton is truly wasteful, that's a few bottles of dragon saliva." Qin Mu was furious. The footsteps in the darkness came closer and closer. 2 huge flood dragons came into their view first, their heads as huge as small mountains. Their long necks then showed up, followed by their sharp claws, and then a pair of feet that were standing on the backs of the 2 flood dragons. The heavy rain filled the air, and the boiling rainwater came down in waterfalls, drenching the gigantic body that was walking out from the darkness. The rainwater cleaned the scales, turning them bright and clear as they reflected the bolts of lightning in the sky. The two flood dragons stopped, and a bolt of lightning tore through the darkness, lighting up the gigantic figure. It was dragon-rearing sovereign. The dragon-rearing sovereign whose head was only left with a few hairs and whose face was as black as charcoal. "You want to block me?" His eyes tore through the darkness like lightning, as if they were two beams of light shining on the body of Mute, who carried a blazing furnace of his back. It seemed like he was trying to see everything about Mute. His voice then exploded like thunder. "Just you alone want to stop me? Hand over that honest-looking brat who burned all of my hair, and I will grant you an intact corpse." Mute was stunned and scratched his head. "Grandpa Mute, he meant me." Qin Mu popped his head out of the divine hall and said honestly and sincerely, "Dragon Sovereign, I was the one who burned your hair, but I didn't do it on purpose. You asked me to feed the dragons, so I fed them well, and they followed me when I left. Afterward, when I saw your hair giving chase, I found it ugly and insulting to your image, so I took the liberty to burn your 3,000 worries." The corner of dragon-rearing sovereign's eyes twitched, but he didn't move his gaze away from Mute. He wanted to do it, but he realized that the instant he looked away, it was highly possible he could receive a fatal blow. "So it's a remnant of founding emperor era." His gaze landed on the furnace behind Mute and he sneered. "You are a descendant of the heavenly creator of the fake celestial heavens during founding emperor era, right? The fake celestial heavens conferred your ancestor the title of heavenly creator and let your heavenly workers create Carefree Village. He then had all of you create Parameter Arc to head to Carefree Village, but it didn't manage to sail there. We heavenly gods sealed all of you up, thinking you remnants would die within, but never would I have expected that there would be someone who would manage to escape. Why are you not talking?" Mute was expressionless. He gave a hand signal. Qin Mu popped his head out of the hall and shouted loudly, "Dragon Sovereign, he is calling you a slut." "It's not me scolding you though, it's him." Dragon-rearing sovereign's face turned even darker. The two flood dragons on his ears stretched their bodies secretly and jumped onto his shoulders. They slid down his arms, growing larger and larger. Their scales were like incomparably intricate mechanisms as they flowed and covered his arms. In his clothes, there were 3 more flood dragons slowly growing larger as they coiled around his waist and thighs. Thump! Dragon-rearing sovereign jumped down from the back of the dragon, and 2 thick dragon claws gripped the ground firmly. The 2 flood dragons that were originally under his feet suddenly shrunk and transformed into 2 truncheons that he grabbed from the ground. Remnant from the Ministry of Works of the fake celestial heavens. Dragon-rearing sovereign shouted loudly. His body contorted, and his weird barbaric dragon strength burst forth from his body. With razor-sharp teeth clenched tightly, he swung his truncheons to smash them at Mute. "Prepare to die?" Dragon-rearing sovereign's body was the corporeal body of a god, and with the addition of 5 dragons coiling around his body and 2 serving as his weapons, his strength multiplied several times. Even though Dragon Rider sect was founded by dragon-rearing sovereign, it only had the abilities to control unusual breeds of dragons and snakes. Its people didn't have the abilities to borrow strength from dragons. But dragon-rearing sovereign's secrets of dragon control could allow one to borrow flood dragon's strength for themselves. Besides that, his dragon-rearing scripture didn't contain all the techniques he had either. He had held back some information. Even though the dragon-rearing scripture in Qin Mu's hand was much more complete than the one passed on to Dragon Rider sect, the most important battle methods were no recorded inside it. When using flood dragons as twin truncheons, his strength was so massive that when he struck, the eardrums of Qin Mu and the rest rang loudly, deafening them for an instant. Not only that strike had emptied out all of the air in the surroundings. It was as if a huge chunk of space had crumbled, and all the air around was sucked away. That was different from the clash of normal strong practitioners. Qin Mu had seen numerous fights between strong practitioners, the struggles between those of cult master level, and even personally witnessed how Eternal Peace Imperial Preceptor quelled the rebellion. The impact from their divine arts didn't really collapse inwards but would explode in all directions with destructive force. However, dragon-rearing sovereign's body was so strong that the impact actually caved inwards. There was no excess power leaking out. All of the destructive power was concentrated in one area, allowing his strength to burst forth with no restraint. Even though the impact that burst forth in all directions looked vast and had astonishing destructive power, its energy was scattered. When the divine art hit the opponent, the power had already been weakened by quite some bit. The fact that it didn't happen when dragon-rearing sovereign attacked represented that he had reached extreme control over his strength. It was the beauty of strength, and that kind of beauty could only be admired by the few who had dedicated their lives to studying strength to its extreme. In the palace hall, Qin Mu and the rest didn't have the time to admire. The air in the hall was sucked out, and the group immediately felt an immense pressure as even what was in their lungs was pulled out. The astonishing pressure seemed to be squeezing them, while due to the air having been cleanly sucked away, there was a sense of their bodies trying to expand outwards. Their eyeballs, heart, lungs, bladder were all expanding while their blood and urine nearly flowed out uncontrollably. They got hit by the air which was trying to leave, and their bodies rose into midair against their will. They flailed as they flew toward the truncheon of dragon-rearing sovereign as though they were sending themselves to their deaths. If they were to be sucked under the truncheons of dragon-rearing sovereign, they would be crushed like ants and lose their lives. Qin Mu hurriedly stretched one hand to grab the thick horn of the buck while his other caught onto Mu Qingdai's hand. The girls' sashes fluttered and coiled themselves around Long Yu's legs, who then grabbed onto Wang Muren. The force pulled the four people in a straight line, and the buck's footing started to become unsteady as it tried to dig for purchase into the ground. However, that didn't stop them from floating out of the hall. The huge buck opened its mouth and clamped his teeth onto the dragon Chiline's tail, who felt a sharp pain and growled furiously. No matter how astonishing the pulling force was, the dragon Chiline remained unmovable. Boom! A world-shaking explosion came from outside of the hall. Dragon-rearing sovereign's strike had to have unleashed its power to clash with Mute, and the resounding tremor shook the four of them violently in midair as though they were struck by countless bolts of lightning. It wasn't exactly what happened though. When Mute and dragon-rearing sovereign's attacks clashed, the strength of their corporeal bodies had created ripples in space, and it undulated up and down violently. The group who was in the air thus moved up and down as well, suffering from the extreme shaking. Blood leaked out from the corners of their mouths. The ripple in space not only subjected them to the tremors, their bodies also warped along with the space, which resulted in their 5 viscera and 6 bowels shifting to wrong places. Their bones also cracked as they couldn't stand the heavy load anymore. Too powerful, the dragon Chiline shouted. I'm close to vomiting. Qin Mu and the rest were feeling so terrible that they were about to vomit blood, yet the fat dragon could still speak with plenty of vitality. At that moment, a bright light burst from the outside, and snow-white light dazzled the group's eyes. When brightness reached an extreme level, it would become darkness, even if they had no idea whose divine art it had been that had turned everything in front of their eyes pitch black. Tears flowed out of their eyes, and they immediately executed their pupil divine arts to prevent their eyes from getting damaged. Thump, thump, thump. Their bodies landed on the ground, however, the next moment the ripple from the second collision came over. Luckily, it seemed to be much farther away. Yet the tremors still turned the ground into something similar like the surface of the sea, rising up in waves. Even a glutton like the dragon Chiline was bounced up. Pack, pack, pack. There were a few crisp smacks as Qin Mu and the rest were flung against the ceiling. Who's the one who constructed these palaces for Granny, such sturdiness, grumbled Qin Mu. Blood leaked out from Qin Mu's mouth due to the collision, and he swallowed down the rest that had bubbled up his throat. In the past, great cult master Qin had demolished numerous houses and palaces. When had he ever met one that was so sturdy? The palaces of heavenly devil cult Saint Arrival Mountain had been demolished without much trouble. Even the Imperial Palace, Imperial College, and palaces of Roland's Golden Palace had been demolished when he got his mind to it. What palaces? He had even demolished a dragon vein. However, the palace that belonged to Granny Sai seemed to be unimaginably durable. When they crashed against the ceiling, their bones almost shattered, yet the roof didn't have a single crack, let alone signs of it collapsing. The ripple produced by the third clash caused Qin Mu and the rest to fall back onto the ground, piling up together. Mu Qingdai was squashed at the very bottom, followed by Wang Muren, Long Yu, Qin Mu, the buck, and the dragon Chiline at the top. Everyone got up in a hurry only to see that the big senior sister of Little Jade Capital had already rolled her eyes. Qin Mu immediately pinched her mouth open and fed her a bottle of dragon saliva. Only then was she rescued. The fourth ripple was even farther away from where they were, but it still wasn't small. The movement in space stretched their bodies up and down, then pulled to the sides and pushed within. When they were stretched to the sides, even Mu Qingdai, who was the thinnest, looked like a plump and round girl in the condensed space. When they were pushed into themselves, even the fattest dragon Qilin looked very slim. His tummy was gone. When it came to the fifth ripple, its effect was already very small, and everyone finally let out sighs of relief. The fight of immortals could only make mortals suffer. Even though they were the more outstanding ones among the divine arts practitioners, they would die miserable deaths if they were the least bit careless when faced with a clash between such strong practitioners. Maha! Maha! Strange cries came from outside, and Qin Mu, who had just let out a sigh of relief, was once again on tenterhooks. While he took out his golden flute, his sight filled with blood-flood dragons jumping down from the roof. Their long limbs landed on the ground, and several hundred creatures encircled the group, blocking them from all directions. Qin Mu played the flute, and the flood dragons coiling around the bronze pillars slowly slithered down to stand guard in front of the hall. Inside, everyone was indescribably nervous. The blood-flood dragons transformed from the blood of a god were numerous. On top of that, even the little jade capital had heard about the power of a god's blood. The youths were successors of Eternal Peace Empire's #1 sacred ground, so the secrets they knew were no lesser in number than those that Qin Mu knew. It wasn't the first time Qin Mu had seen the blood of a god or a devil before. He had seen its power when he was with village chief in Great Ruins, and he had also seen the lonely mountain ridge root demon who had been nourished by the blood of a god and devil. He had also seen the pool of God's blood left behind from the fight of Imperial Preceptor and a god from high heavens. Yet exactly how strong were the blood-flood dragons formed from dragon-rearing sovereign's blood, he had no idea. Even though he had borrowed the golden flute to sense and control the flood dragons, he had no confidence in them blocking the attacks. The most dangerous thing was the peculiar energy contained in the god's blood that formed the blood-flood dragons. They moved rapidly outside the hall, leaping here and there. They were like a pack of hyenas, waiting for their chance to strike. Suddenly, a blood-flood dragon roared twice, and its brethren pounced into the huge hall in an instant. The sound of Qin Mu's flute rang loudly, and the guarding flood dragons roared as they pounced on the blood-flood dragons. The creatures that Qin Mu controlled were incomparably powerful. They were the dragons that dragon-rearing sovereign had spent numerous years raising, so their abilities were extremely high, blocking hundreds of blood-flood dragons. Those creatures were shredded by the dozen or so genuine flood dragons, turning into balls of blood mist. Compared to the flood dragons that were raised up by dragon-rearing sovereign, the abilities of the blood-flood dragons were still too weak. Outside, the roars gradually quietened down. Only the pattering of rain and the melodious melody of Qin Mu's flute could be heard. The flute quietened down. The pattering of the rain became even more resounding. Everyone in the hall stood with nervous expressions, not daring to relax. They looked out of the hall and saw lightning flash through the sky, bolt after bolt, lighting up the darkness. The expression of Qin Mu and the rest flickered between light and darkness. A flood dragon slowly retreated and moved from the entrance of the hall to the inside. Qin Mu's heart sank. He saw the second flood dragon retreating into the hall, followed by the third, the fourth. The dozen or so flood dragons seemed to have met their nemesis, something that terrified them. They retreated one after another while passing by the group. "Who's outside?" Long Yu croaked. The sound of something satiny rolling around came from the outside. It was followed by heavy footsteps, which sounded as though they were stepping on their hearts as the person got closer, step by step. Qin Mu played his golden flute again, but the dozen or so flood dragons lowered their heads onto the floor, not moving. Cold sweat formed on Qin Mu's forehead, and a tall and sturdy figure appeared at the entrance of the hall, blocking it. That figure belonged to dragon-rearing sovereign who was made purely of blood. When the dragon Qilin saw him, his muscles went limp. He sprawled out on the ground and didn't dare to move. The corners of Qin Mu's eyes twitched. Dragon-rearing sovereign had a natural suppression over flood dragons he had raised. On top of that, there was a kind of special aura about his body which made the dragon Qin afraid to resist. The blacksmith you called over had truly strong abilities. Dragon-rearing sovereign who was formed by God's blood revealed his crimson teeth. His blood-red eyes stared at Qin Mu when he said coldly, "However, he can't protect you. Little thing, show me another honest smile." Qin Mu forced out a smile and shouted out to the others, "Merely a pile of God's blood, let's team up and destroy him." Not this smile. Dragon-rearing sovereign stared at Qin Mu's face and shook his head. In the past, your smile was of the kind that could make anyone let down their guard. Even if a knife was in your hand and you stabbed someone in the heart, they would still be unable to put their guard up. Whereas now, you are merely giving me a forced smile, a fake smile. This isn't the honest smile from your heart. Listening to his words, Wang Muren, Mu Qingdai, and Long Yu who were at Qin Mu's side shuddered. Even the huge buck's eyes popped out in fear. They didn't have much interaction with Qin Mu, but they were still considered friends. When they were together with him, it was easy for them to forget that he still had another identity besides that of the human emperor. He was the Heavenly Devil Cult Master. The #1 devil of Heavenly Devil Cult. It was simply that it was just too easy to forget about his identities when being around him. No matter if he was Heavenly Devil Cult Master or Human Emperor, they just felt that he was a friend worth making. However, listening to Dragon-rearing Sovereign's words, they felt chills run down their back. As expected of Heavenly Devil Cult Master, no wonder people call him Old Devil, Long Yu thought to himself. The human emperor of this generation is truly hard to pin down, even a godlike dragon-rearing sovereign was at a disadvantage in his hands. Qin Mu shook his head and said, "Dragon Sovereign, you made me out to be too scary. I never scheme against my friends." His expression was so sincere that anyone who saw him would find him a reliable person. When Wang Muren and the rest saw that expression, the uneasiness in their hearts vanished. "This is the right one." Dragon-rearing sovereign sneered and said, "The sincerity from the depths of your heart. You can still reveal this kind of sincere smile which is even slightly bashful. What a joke, stealing my dragons in the blink of an eye." His aura suddenly burst forth frantically, raising currents of air to smash forth in all directions. When they hit the walls, loud bangs rang out like raging waves splitting the shore. Qin Mu was astonished. He circulated Overlord Body 3 elixir technique, and his corporeal body became incomparably tense. At the same time, his sword sheath burst open, and Carefree Sword rushed in a blocking position in front of his chest. The next moment, there was a loud bang, and Qin Mu flew backward with Carefree Sword. His feet moved rapidly in the air as he executed Cripple's heaven-pilfering divine legs to get rid of the powerful after effects. However, the strength of Dragon-rearing Sovereign was simply too great. Even a wondrous technique like heaven-pilfering divine legs wasn't enough to completely get rid of its force. Qin Mu, in the end, couldn't move back anymore and smashed into the wall behind him. Wang Muren, Mu Qingdai, and Long Yu didn't hesitate anymore, and they all made their moves, unleashing their strongest attacks toward Dragon-rearing Sovereign. The three of them were all disciples of Little Jade Capital, and it used the most traditional way of choosing their disciples. They would first walk through the human world to choose the youths with the best aptitude before observing their character as well as patience, comprehension, adaptability, and other abilities. They would then have to pass numerous tests before being taken in as disciples. The three of them were brought to Little Jade Capital like that, and what they learned were the best techniques and divine arts, thus their cultivation was naturally extremely strong. It could be said that every step they took was extremely solid, and they had nearly no flaws in any realm. On Six Directions realm, there were few that could surpass them. What Long Yu executed was Heavenly Eye Sword Heart, and two trails of sword light shot out from his eyes. One went in a horizontal manner and the other vertical when they slashed toward Dragon-rearing Sovereign. Mu Qingdai executed strange Dao strict Jiao scriptures. It was a kind of technique that cultivated both Taoism and Buddhism. It was quiet like a bodhisattva tree and moved like an immortal traveling. When she raised her hand, 10,000 rays would form a huge palm which would retain its gracefulness. The two of them were skilled in cultivating the techniques of Little Jade Capital, and they had put in a lot of hard work on one technique. Wang Muren, however, had taken a totally different route. Because of his master Wanderazhan's death, he pondered about the painful experience and always wanted to take revenge on Eternal Peace Empire. He treated Imperial Preceptor as the enemy in his mind, so he cultivated numerous techniques. He knew that with just Wanderazhan's technique alone, he could never surpass Wanderazhan no matter how well he cultivated. Yet his master had still died in the hands of Eternal Peace Imperial Preceptor, so he could only open up another path. Only then could he have a chance to surpass Eternal Peace Imperial Preceptor. Wanderer Qin Mu and the rest also knew what he was thinking, so they took good care of him. They taught him personally and imparted their ultimate arts to him. Thus, even though Wang Muren was the youngest disciple in Little Jade Capital, his abilities were the highest. However, the divine arts from the three of them couldn't touch Dragon-rearing Sovereign. The god's speed was simply too fast. What they hit was the afterimage left behind after he had already moved. Once the afterimage shattered, only then did they know that their divine arts had missed. Dragon-rearing Sovereign paid no attention to the three of them and sprinted straight at Qin Mu, who was flying away. His speed was so fast that the trio simply couldn't catch up to him. The buck's footsteps were extremely fast, and its 4 hooves brought him in front of Dragon-rearing Sovereign. It waved its horns like they were spirit weapons. "Be gone, animal!" After a loud shout, the body of the buck flew away and crashed through a wall into the heavy rain outside. "Open your eyes!" Wang Muren shouted sternly. Mu Qingdai and Long Yu instantly came to a realization. Dragon-rearing Sovereign's speed was too fast, to the point that their naked eyes could no longer capture his trace. Only by activating pupil divine arts could they only capture his figure. When Dragon-rearing Sovereign was blocked by the huge buck, his speed had been slightly slowed. But soon, it was raised once again, and the air in the hall was compressed into a wall with his movement. Behind him, Wang Muren and his friends felt a strong suction force pulling them forward, so they just used that force to rush toward Dragon-rearing Sovereign. Meanwhile, in front of him, Qin Mu swallowed the blood that had come up in his throat. Countless flying swords flew out from his Daotai sack and rushed into the sky. In that instant, he used sword-treading mountains and rivers. The first move that village chief had imparted flashed with sword lights. The power of that move had yet to be completely unleashed when the mountains and rivers were shattered. Dragon-rearing Sovereign tore through with brute force. Qin Mu's eyes lit up, and carefree sword stabbed forward. He had been waiting for that chance. He was merely on 6 Directions realm, and Wang Muren and the rest were the same. The huge buck couldn't defeat the Dragon Qilin, while the Dragon Qilin and the rest of the Flood Dragons were afraid of the aura of Dragon-rearing Sovereign, so they didn't dare to move. Thus, the youths were no match for Dragon-rearing Sovereign. This video will end here.